Hello and welcome to this revision video for Paper 1 Question 5. This video will focus on reminding you how to structure an effective narrative for Paper 1 Question 5. For this video, you will need only a pen and paper for notes and a flashcard at the end to boil the information down for your revision. Remember that Paper 1 Question 5 is worth 40 marks. This is 50% of Paper 1 and 25% of your English language GCSE altogether. It is therefore vital that we prepare heavily for this question. And our advice, remember, is to go in with a structure and a plan that you fit to the question rather than trying to plan on the day. So, how do we structure a narrative effectively? We recommend the drop, panorama, zoom in, zoom out, flash and end structure. In this video, we will go through this structure step by step. Broadly, we are talking about dropping your reader into the action, describing the setting in detail, zooming in on your character, zooming back out to the action, flashing back to an important memory, and then ending where you began in a cyclical structure. In the exam, you can use this structure to plan. Let's look at a possible exam question. Write the opening of a story about a time you felt truly scared. Remember that the you does not mean it has to be an experience you've genuinely had. You can be as creative as you like. Using this structure, we could possibly plan something as simple as a sudden scream, a house in a forest, a character, maybe by the name of Laura. She's alone, she's vulnerable, but she's determined. We move inside the house, we hear a strange noise. We flash back to a broken memory of a familiar voice. And then we end with a really sinister second scream. The first stage of your narrative is to drop your reader into the action of the story. Draw them in quickly with a sense of pace and urgency. We suggest 3 ways that you could try dropping your reader into the story. The first is to start with some dramatic sentences, using short, short, long, long, short. For example, a scream, a cry, a bellow that comes from nowhere and everywhere at the same time, a bellow that seems to make the trees tremble and the skies quake, a scream. From where? Our second suggestion is that you could start with the phrase, this story starts, or this story started. For example, this story started 13 years ago. It started on a day when I thought my life was over. A day when I thought nothing would ever be the same again. A day I thought I would never overcome. It started with thunder. Or our final suggestion is that you could start with a series of successive, repetitive questions, such as, what was I thinking? For example, what was I thinking? Packing my things, running away, leaving it all behind. Where did I think I was going? All of these suggestions would be effective ways of dropping the reader into the story, and they're all strategies that you can practice and practice and practice until they become second nature, and then you can fit them into lots and lots of different stories. Of these 3, which do you prefer? Take it forward and let's use it. The second step of our narrative is to introduce our setting by painting a panorama with words. Remember, a panorama is a wide-lensed image of a setting, and so our aim is to be as descriptive as we possibly can. There are 3 steps for this. The first is to mind map all of the details of your setting, drawing on the 5 senses. The second is then to personify all of these details as much as possible to bring the setting to life. And then the final step is to write that up, trying to paint a picture with your words. For an example, if we were setting our story in an eerie abandoned house in a forest, we might mind map details such as the trees, its branches, and the windows. We could then personify these details, such as clouds that suffocate the blue skies, floorboards which groan and yawn, and this personification very quickly helps us to create atmosphere and bring our setting to life. When we write it up, we are careful not to just list these things, but to use them to paint a vivid picture of our setting. Practice this now. Pause the video and try to write up these descriptions yourself. you might end up with something a little like this. Clouds suffocated the once blue skies. Like a ghost reaching through the mist, a wooden house appeared, old, dilapidated. It was flanked by tall, portentous trees which stood guard like sentinels. Their branches seemed to scratch and grasp at the air like skeletal fingers. The windows of the house peered out over the fields like hollow eyes. They seemed to beckon Laura forward, calling her to enter. Practice this again with a different setting. Perhaps do something totally different, like a tranquil beach. Mind map the things that you'd see, the things that you'd hear, the things that you'd taste and smell and touch. Personify these things and then try to paint a picture with those words. After your panorama, the next step is to zoom in on our character. With only 45 minutes to plan and write our stories, we only want to focus on one character, and we are only going to hint at details about them rather than try to tell their life story. When we zoom in on the character, we're going to do it in 4 steps. We will say something about them through their clothing, say something about them through their body language, say something about them through the perspective of other people, and then finish with a single line of dialogue. For example, Laura pulled over her hood, hiding her face in shadows. Shoulders hunched and fingers clenched, she strode forwards, each step more determined than the last. Closer and closer. Her mother always said that she'd amount to nothing, that she was a no-hoper, no destiny. She said that, if it ever came down to it, Laura would always choose to run. Not today, she whispered. Have a little think about our character here. What have we revealed through her clothing and her body language? What does the mother's perspective and the single line of dialogue add to what we know about this character? And again, practice this yourself. Think of a character that you'll continue to use in your stories from now on. What are they wearing? What does that tell you about them? How do they carry themselves? How do they walk? What does that tell us about them? And if you had to get their mother's perspective or their father's perspective, what would they say about them? What would their opinion be? And then finally, if they had to say one thing in response to that, what would that be? Practice these 4 stages, and what you end up with is a fairly interesting way to introduce a character. Next, after describing our character, we need to zoom back out to the setting and the action. This time, something changes. Perhaps the air grows colder, perhaps there is sudden silence, maybe the weather changes. Then something happens. Perhaps something dramatic, then something exciting. Remember, we zoom out, something changes, something happens. For example, taking a first tentative step inside, Laura felt the air turn chill. The darkness of the house seemed to swallow her whole. Under her feet, floorboards yawned and groaned like dying men, and a whistling cry of wind echoed through the cavernous rooms. Upstairs, a noise, a spluttering, heavy breathing, a voice. Laura's blood ran cold. In this example, the change is first the temperature of the air to create a sinister atmosphere. Then there is a noise. It is ambiguous, but enough to keep our reader hooked. Something changes, something happens. One of the last steps is to introduce a flashback. We need to avoid using this word, however, and instead we will introduce something familiar that triggers a memory. In order to avoid needing to tell too much backstory, we can suggest that it is a broken memory, unclear and ambiguous. However, this memory should lead to a dramatic realization. For example, the voice jolted her memory. Her thoughts were plunged headfirst into the ocean of the past, underwater, drowning. She knew that voice from somewhere, its deep timbre, the way its words cut at the air, and it filled her with terror. But the memory was broken, fragments and shards of thoughts and feelings, scattered like dust into sand. Who was it? Where had she heard it before? A laugh from above, and then Laura realised it was him. In this example, the ambiguity is effective in helping to sustain the eerie atmosphere of our story. It leaves the reader deliberately with questions. Finally, we come to the end of our structure, where we need to mirror or echo our opening. Look at the example echoes for our 3 drops. These are just suggestions, but they are possible ways of bringing each opening full circle. The first uses the phrases from the short, short, long, long, short to create a chilling and ambiguous ending. The second ends the story with drama and emphasis, and the last, ending with successive questions, leaves the reader with a dramatic uncertainty. Even though none of these endings are true endings to the story itself, by going back to the start they create a sense of finality that makes the ambiguity powerful rather than unsatisfying. Practice this. Look at your opening and ask yourself how you could echo or mirror this. How could you bring your story full circle? To finish, let's remember the following. We need to practice this drop, panorama, zoom in, zoom out, flash and end model over and over and over again. We need to write a little very well, not a lot badly. You're writing the best page of a novel, not the whole novel itself. For this question, you should and can pre-prepare and practice sections of the narrative ahead of the exam. It's worth 50%, 25% of the whole GCSE English language. We need to put a lot of pre-preparation into this question. And finally, remember to check your SPAG at the end of any episode of writing practice. Go through, check your vocab, check your spelling, check that semicolon, that colon, check you've used full stops where they need to be, capital letters, and all of those basics that we know are so easy to miss. On this slide, there's a series of example questions that you can apply this structure to. Why not have a go? Plan a couple, write a few, and bring them in so we can have a mark. Good luck!